The first blade came out of the dark aimed at Sharamph Bonecrusher's throat, and she was already moving before it cleared its sheath. She caught the wrist of the man wielding it and broke it with a sound like a green branch snapping, and still she was too slow to stop the second man's dagger from opening a line of fire along her ribs. 3 of them. She had counted 3 shapes drop from the hayloft of the stable yard behind the Crossroads Inn, and 3 was a number she had faced before, alone, more times than she could count on both hands. She had been fighting alone since she was old enough to stand upright and hold a blade steady, and she intended to keep breathing long enough to make that for a bad decision on someone's part. She drove her elbow into the second man's jaw and felt bone give, and the third came at her from behind with a length of rope meant for her neck, not her wrists, which told her plainly enough that this was not a robbery. This was murder dressed up as one. She twisted, took the rope across her forearm instead of her throat, and slammed her attacker into the stable wall hard enough to rattle the shingles above. But the wound in her side was bleeding freely now, and the man with the broken wrist had drawn a second knife with his good hand, and for one long breath the knight tilted sideways around her. That was when the hammer came down. It was not a war hammer. It was a smith's hammer, iron-headed, oak-handled, worn smooth by years of honest work, and it came down on the collarbone of the man with the rope so hard he dropped where he stood. The man who swung it was broad through the shoulders in the particular way of someone who had spent a decade at a forge, his forearms streaked with old burned scars and fresh soot, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, even though the night was cold enough to frost the stable troughs. He set his boots wide, the way a man sets himself before a blow he means to land, and he did not look like he had ever swung that hammer at anything that could scream before. "Get behind me," he said to her, which was, in the entire history of Sharamph Bonecrusher's life, a sentence exactly no one had ever said and meant. She did not get behind him. She put her back to his instead, shoulder to shoulder, so that the 3 of them, 2 down, one still standing with a knife shaking in his fist, had to choose which target to come at, and neither choice was a good one anymore. The last man looked at the orc woman bleeding from the ribs with murder still bright in her yellow eyes, and at the human blacksmith with a hammer already lifting for a second swing, and he made the only sensible decision left to him. He ran. Samuel Graves let him go. He turned instead to the woman at his back, and found himself looking, for the first time in full lantern light spilling from the inn's kitchen window, at the most striking creature he had ever laid eyes on in 29 years of a quiet, ordinary life. She was taller than him by half a head, and he was not a small man, and built with the kind of dangerous grace that came from a lifetime of combat rather than a season of training. Green-gray skin caught the lantern glow like river stone after rain. Her black hair was bound back in a warrior's braid, threaded through, with small bones and beads that clicked faintly when she moved. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and supple, laced snug up the sides and cinched at a waist that curved sharply before flaring into strong hips and long, powerful legs, the leather worn soft in places from years of riding and fighting and living hard. A hunting knife rode her hip, and a short, wicked-looking axe was slung across her back, though it had done her no good against 3 men who had leapt her from above before she could reach it. Tusks, small and neat, pressed against her lower lip when she scowled, which she was doing now fiercely at the blood soaking through her side. "You should not have done that," she said. Her voice was low and rough, edged like a blade dragged over stone, and it did not sound grateful. It sounded angry. "Done what?" Samuel said. "Helped. Interfered." She pressed a hand to her ribs and hissed. "I did not ask for a human blacksmith to fight my battles." "Didn't ask," Samuel agreed. "But there were 3 of them and 1 rope, and I don't much like the arithmetic of that, ma'am, so I did it anyway." Something in her expression flickered surprise, maybe, or the particular affront of a woman who had never once in her life been rescued and did not know what to do with the sensation. She swayed on her feet. He caught her elbow before she quite understood she was falling, and for one strange, suspended moment they stood there in the lantern light, an orc clan heir bleeding into her own leathers, and a village blacksmith with a hammer still gripped white-knuckled in his fist, closer to each other than either of them had been to anyone in a very long time. "I am Sharamph Bonecrusher," she said, as if daring him to flinch at the name, as if she expected him to. "Samuel Graves," he said. "Let's get that side looked at before you bleed out arguing with me about it." She did not smile. But she did not pull her arm away either, and she let him walk her toward the light of the inn, and something about the whole shape of that first hour, the blood, the hammer, the two of them standing back to back against the dark, would turn out to be the whole shape of everything that came after. The crossroads sat where the northern trade road forked toward the mountain passes, and the eastern road ran down toward the walled market towns of the lowlands. And for 200 years, it had been the one place in the whole border country where merchants and drovers and soldiers, and now, orc envoys all slept under the same roof and pretended, for the length of a night, that the old war was truly over. Sharamph had ridden in 3 days earlier with a battered saddlebag, a treaty scroll sealed in orc wax, and no escort at all, because the 6 warriors sent with her had been ambushed a week out from the mountains, and she had buried what was left of them herself, alone, with her bare hands and a borrowed shovel, and then ridden on because turning back was not a thing her father's daughter did. She was the last living heir of the Bonecrusher clan. Her father, Chief Sharamph Bonecrusher, had died 2 winters past in a border skirmish that neither side had wanted, and both sides blamed the other for starting. And in the chaos after his death, half the clan's rivals had circled like wolves scenting a wound, certain that a woman worse, a woman not yet 30 winters, could never hold what her father had built. She had held it. She had fought 3 challengers for the right to keep her father's seat, had won each duel with her father's own axe, and had then done the thing none of them expected. She had ridden south, alone, to offer the border towns a trade of iron ore and grain for grazing rights, and an end to the raiding that had bled both peoples for a generation. Peace, she had decided, was worth more to her clan than pride. But peace required trust, and trust required her to sit alone in a room full of men who had been raised to fear the shape of her, and argue for a future none of them quite believed in. She had been doing it for 3 days when someone decided it would be easier to simply kill her before she could sign anything. The innkeeper, a broad, worried woman named Mistress Odell, fussed over the wound in Sharamph's side with the brisk competence of someone who had stitched up drovers and drunks for 30 years, and did not so much as blink at the green-gray skin under her needle, which told Sharamph something about the woman's character that the woman's words never quite managed to. Samuel stood in the doorway of the small back room with his hammer still hanging forgotten from one hand, unwilling to leave, uncertain he was welcome to stay. Caught in that particular helpless orbit, a man falls into around someone he has just discovered he cannot look away from. "You are still here," Sharamph said, without opening her eyes, while Mistress Odell drew the thread through her flesh with a wince Sharamph did not share. "Wanted to make sure the arithmetic worked out," Samuel said. 3 men, 1 hammer, seemed worth confirming. That finally earned him something close to a smile, a small, unwilling curl at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came, but he had seen it, and he found he wanted very badly to see it again. "You are not what I expected of the men in this town," she said. "Most folks here have never known an orc," Samuel admitted. "I haven't either, if I'm honest. Never had cause to. And now I've got cause," he said, "and I find I don't much mind it." She studied him for a long moment with those yellow eyes, sharp and unreadable, the eyes of someone who had learned very young that kindness was a thing to be suspicious of, because kindness was so often the mask worn just before the knife came out. But there had been no mask on this man's face when he swung that hammer. There had been nothing on it at all but plain, uncomplicated resolve, the look of a man doing the obvious thing because the obvious thing needed doing, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she believed him. "Thank you, Samuel Graves," she said, and the words cost her something, he could tell, the way a person pays out a coin they have been hoarding a long time. "You're welcome, Sharamph Bonecrusher," he said, and got her name right on the first try, which was, apparently, also a thing no one had ever quite bothered to do. The days that followed moved with the strange, charged momentum of a fuse burning toward something neither of them could yet name. The magistrate of the border town, a careful, aging man named Lord Aldous Rennick, was desperate for the treaty to hold, desperate enough that he doubled the watch on the inn and questioned every stable hand and drover who had passed through the yard that night, and found nothing, because whoever had hired those 3 men had been careful to leave no thread to pull. Sharamph, healing but far from healed, refused to stay abed, and instead sat each morning in the inn's common room with the treaty scroll spread before her, arguing terms with merchants who eyed her tusks more than her arguments, and each evening she found some reason to walk down to the smithy at the edge of the village, ostensibly to have her mare reshod, though the mare, in truth, had needed no such thing for a week. Samuel's forge sat at the crossroad's western edge, close enough to the inn that the ring of his hammer carried on quiet nights, and it was there, among the heat and the sparks and the good honest smell of hot iron, that the two of them found the only hours that belonged wholly to themselves. He taught her the names of his tools, more out of a need to fill the silence than any real belief she cared, and found instead that she listened with the same fierce, total attention she gave to a duel, as if every word he said mattered, as if he mattered, in a way that made something in his chest ache with a longing he had no ready name for. "You have no wife," she said one evening, not quite a question, watching him work a glowing bar of iron into the curve of a new axe head, her axe head, though she had not asked him to make it and he had not told her he was. "No," Samuel said. "Never found the right reason to look, I suppose. Village is small. Everyone's known everyone since we were children, throwing mud at each other. Nothing much left to discover." "And I am something to discover," Sharamph said, and it was not entirely a jest. "You," Samuel said, setting down the hammer, meeting those yellow eyes across the forge light, "are the first thing in 10 years that's made me forget to eat my supper." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, low and warm and entirely unguarded, and the sound of it did something to him that the sight of her in the stable yard, blade-quick and blood-marked, had not quite managed. He had seen her fierce. Now he had made her laugh, and he wanted, with a sudden and total clarity, to spend the rest of his life finding ways to do it again. "In my clan," she said, when the laugh had faded but the warmth in her eyes had not, "we do not waste words on courtship the way your people do. A warrior does not send flowers. A warrior brings meat to the fire, or stands at another's shoulder in a fight, or gives a gift forged with their own hands, and if the other accepts it, the matter is settled without 100 pretty speeches." "Sounds efficient," Samuel said, throat suddenly dry. "It is," Sharamph agreed. She looked at the half-finished axe head glowing on his anvil, and did not pretend she had not noticed its shape matched her father's old blade, and did not pretend, either, that the noticing did not sit warm and strange in her chest. "You should finish that," she said. "I find I am curious to see if it holds an edge." He finished it 3 nights later, alone in the forge past midnight, quenching the steel with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and when he presented it to her in the gray hour before dawn, wrapped in oiled cloth because he had no better ceremony to offer, she unwrapped it slowly, turned it once in the lantern light, and then looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, something unguarded, something almost afraid of its own hope. "You made this for me," she said. "Made it because it felt like it should exist," Samuel said. "But yes, for you." She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she stepped close, closer than courtesy required, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, smell wood smoke and leather and something underneath that was only her, and she said, low and rough, "In my clan, this is how a warrior tells another that she wishes to stand at their shoulder for the rest of her life, not only in one fight." "Then I hope," Samuel said, heart hammering harder than it ever had over any anvil, You'll let me be the one you stand next to." "I have fought alone since I could stand on my own 2 feet, Samuel Graves," she said, and her voice cracked on the words in a way that told him exactly how much they cost her to say aloud. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to want someone at my side and not fear what it means to lose them." "You don't have to know how," he said. "We'll learn it together, or not at all." She kissed him then. She was the one who closed the distance, the one who cupped his soot-streaked jaw in a hand strong enough to break stone and gentle enough not to bruise, the one who claimed his mouth like she claimed everything else in her life, without apology and without half measures. And Samuel Graves, village blacksmith, 29 years alone and unremarked, felt the whole shape of his quiet life reorganize itself around the fact that this magnificent, fearless woman had looked at every other man on the trade road and chosen instead him. They did not have long to simply be happy in it. 10 days after the ambush in the stable yard, a grain merchant named Corwin Aldish was found dead in an alley behind the market hall, his throat opened with a blade the width and curve of an orc hunting knife. And by mid-morning half the town had convinced itself of exactly what someone very much wanted them to believe. Sharamph was arrested before noon. Samuel heard the news from a boy running full tilt down the trade road shouting that the reeve had taken the orc woman in chains, and he dropped the tongs he was holding, left a horseshoe half-formed on the anvil, and ran the whole way to the market square with his heart trying to climb out through his throat. The scene that met him there would stay carved behind his eyes for the rest of his life. Sharamph stood in the center of the square, wrists bound in iron behind her back, surrounded by a crowd that had gathered fast and ugly, the way crowds did when fear found something convenient to point at. Someone had thrown a rotten apple that struck her cheek and left a dark smear against her green-gray skin, and she had not flinched, had not so much as blinked, had simply stood there with her chin high and her eyes flat with a rage she was holding leashed by will alone, because a single wrong move now would be called proof of guilt. She was seen near the alley. The reeve, a wiry, ambitious man named Garrick Thorne, was shouting to the crowd, holding up a bloodied knife that was, Samuel noted with a cold, sick lurch, nothing at all like the short hunting blade Sharamph actually carried on her hip. Found not 10 paces from the body, orc-forged, orc-sized. What more proof do good folk need? "That's not her knife," Samuel said, pushing through the press of bodies until he stood between the crowd and the woman he loved, close enough to feel the heat of her fury radiating off her like a forge fire. "I've seen her blade 100 times. That one's not it." "And you'd know, wouldn't you, Smith?" someone called out, ugly and knowing, "seeing as you've been keeping her warm at night." The crowd's mood curdled further at that, laughter and jeers tangling with the fear, and someone else bent to pick up a stone, and Samuel felt something in himself go very still and very hard, the same stillness that came over him in the half-second before a hammer fell true. "Anyone who throws something at her," he said, not loudly, but in a voice that carried anyway, the voice of a man who had never in his life made an idle threat and was not about to start, "throws it through me first." He stood there unarmed, soot still on his forearms from the morning's work, between an armed reeve and a hostile crowd and the woman in chains, and did not move, and for one taut, terrible moment nobody in that square knew what was going to happen next. It was Lord Aldous Rennick who broke the silence, striding into the square with his own guard at his back, his old face set in lines of genuine grief and genuine fear for the treaty crumbling in his hands. "Enough," he said. "There will be a trial, not a stoning. Take her to the jail. Smith, get out of the way before you're taken up with her." "Then take me up with her," Samuel said, "because I'm not moving." Sharamph, chained and bloodied and furious, turned her head just enough to look at him, and in her yellow eyes he saw something that undid him completely, not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that, but recognition, the look of a woman finally understanding that the man beside her meant to stay there no matter the cost, and did not know herself what to do with the size of that feeling. "Go, Samuel," she said low for him alone. Living, I can fight this. Dead beside me in a square, you help no one. He hated that she was right. He let the guards move him back, and he watched them lead her away toward the jail at the edge of the square, chin still high, and he swore to himself, in the cold, clear voice of a man who had just found the one thing in his life he was not willing to lose, that he would find whoever had put that knife in that alley if it took every hour left to him. He did not have to look far. He simply had to look at who benefited from a war reigniting between the border towns and the Orc clans. And there was exactly one man in the whole trade road country who stood to gain from that Lord Cashin Vald, a border lord 2 valleys east whose fortunes had been built on smuggled arms sold to both sides during the last war, and whose fortunes had shrunk to nothing in the 2 years of uneasy peace since. And there was exactly one man close enough to the treaty negotiations, close enough to know Sharamph's movements and habits, close enough to plant a false knife in an alley and call it evidence, to have done Vald's work for him. Garrick Thorne the Reeve had arrived in the border town only 8 months prior, with letters of recommendation nobody had ever bothered to verify, from a lord nobody had ever bothered to name. Samuel spent 2 days tearing through every scrap of information he could find, calling in every debt of friendship he had ever quietly built as the town's blacksmith, the man who shod every horse, mended every plow, and heard every piece of gossip that passed through his forge door. A stable hand remembered Garrick Thorne meeting a stranger on the eastern road the night before the murder. A tavern girl remembered the Reeve paying a debt in coin stamped with Vald's own sigil, coin he should never have had. Mistress Odell, sharp-eyed and furious on Sharamph's behalf, remembered the Reeve asking pointed questions about the Orc woman's evening habits, about when she walked alone, about when the smith was not beside her. It was not enough. Suspicion was not proof, and Lord Aldous Rennick, however much he might privately doubt the Reeve, could not set aside a murdered merchant and a crowd baying for blood on the strength of stable gossip alone. The trial was set for 3 days hence. If found guilty, and the town's mood made guilt feel, to Samuel, like a foregone conclusion dressed up in the empty ceremony of a hearing. The sentence for murder on the trade road was death by hanging, carried out at dawn in the same square where she had stood chained and unbowed. Samuel visited the jail every day the guards would allow him, and some days they would not, and on those days he stood outside the small barred window at the back of the building and talked to her anyway, about nothing, about the weather and the price of iron and the mare that missed her, because he could not bear the thought of a single day passing in which she did not hear a voice that loved her. "You should not be wasting your hours on me," she told him through the bars on the second night, her voice steadier than he had any right to expect from a woman 3 days from a noose. "Spend them finding proof instead." "I'm doing both," Samuel said. "Don't tell me how to spend my own hours, Sharamph. I've got precious little else worth spending them on." "That is not true," she said. "You have a forge, a trade, a whole life you built with your own 2 hands before I ever rode into it." And it was a good life, Samuel agreed. Quiet, steady. Lonely as an empty road, if I'm honest, though I didn't have the words for that until you showed up bleeding in my stable yard and ruined the whole shape of it. He pressed his palm flat against the cold iron bars, and after a moment she pressed hers against the other side, green-gray fingers against soot-scarred ones, the only touch the jail allowed them. "I don't want the quiet life back," he said. "I want the one where you're in it, whatever that costs." "It may cost you everything," she said. "This town does not forgive easily, and I have given them a dead man to be afraid of." "Then we'll give them the truth instead," Samuel said, "and hope truth outweighs fear." "It usually does, eventually. Just sometimes takes longer than we'd like." He did not tell her that night how thin the thread of proof he had gathered truly was. He did not want her to spend her last hours before a trial afraid for him instead of herself. But he lay awake long after, staring at the dark rafters of his own empty smithy, turning the pieces over and over, and it was near dawn when the answer finally came to him. not proof of Garrick Thorne's guilt, not yet, but a way to force it into the light. The trial itself was a brief, brutal thing, held in the market square before half the town, with Lord Aldous Rennick presiding from a raised bench and the murder weapon laid on a table before him like an accusation made solid. Garrick Thorne stood as witness, smooth and confident, recounting a story that fit together far too neatly, and Samuel, standing in the crowd with his jaw set, watched the townsfolk's faces harden with each word, watched fear do the work that evidence should have had to earn. Sharamph stood before the bench in her chains, and when Lord Rennick asked if she had anything to say in her own defense, she raised her chin and said, in a voice that did not shake, "I did not kill that man. I have killed in war, and I have killed in duels fought fair and named, and I have never once hidden the blood on my hands afterward. If I had done this, Lord Rennick, I would tell you so to your face, because a coward's lie is the one thing my father never taught me and the one thing I will not learn now, chained or not. It was not proof. It was only the truth, spoken plainly by a woman who had never learned to dress it up prettier than it was, and it was not enough, because the crowd had already decided what they wanted to believe, and Lord Rennick, grieving and frightened and out of options, pronounced the sentence with a heaviness in his voice that told Samuel the old man did not truly believe it either, and did it anyway, because a town afraid needed someone to blame, and he did not have the strength left to give them nothing. Death at dawn by hanging in the square. Samuel spent that last night not sleeping but working forging in the dark, by the light of a single banked coal, a thing he had no time to finish properly and finished anyway, because it was the only weapon he had left that might matter, and because some part of him, the part that had watched her fight 3 men alone in a stable yard and refused to be anything but exactly herself, believed she would forgive him for being reckless if it meant she got to keep breathing. Dawn came gray and cold over the market square, and half the town turned out to watch, because half the town had convinced itself that watching justice done would make the fear go away, and the other half came because they did not believe it was justice at all and could not stay home and pretend otherwise. A gallows had been built overnight at the square's center, crude and hurried, and Sharamph Bonecrusher was led up its steps with her wrists still bound, her chin still high, her eyes finding Samuel's face in the crowd and holding there as if his was the only sight in the whole square worth keeping. The executioner set the noose over her head. Lord Rennick, ashen, unrolled the parchment to read the sentence aloud one final time, his hands shaking on the paper, and that was when Mistress Odell's voice cracked across the square like a whip. "Wait, wait, in the name of every god that hears prayers on this road, wait." She came shoving through the crowd with the tavern girl at her heels and the stable hand behind them both, and behind them, moving fast, a figure in a border patrol's colors that Samuel had spent the whole of the previous night persuading to ride hard for the eastern garrison and back with exactly this. A captain of the King's Road, wardens, and in his hand, a satchel of letters seized from a courier caught crossing the border that very dawn, letters sealed with Lord Cashin Vald's own sigil. Letters naming Garrick Thorne, reeve of the Crossroads district, as the man paid to see the Orc Treaty burned and the border set alight again for profit. "Cut her down," the road warden captain shouted, already running. "Cut her down now, this is no murderess. This is a woman about to die for a crime that man there arranged with his own hand." The executioner froze, blade half-drawn to cut the trapdoor's rope, uncertain, and in that single frozen heartbeat, with the noose already tightening and the crowd surging and shouting and Lord Rennick fumbling with the letters thrust into his hands, Garrick Thorne broke and ran for the square's edge, and it was Samuel Graves who reached the gallows first. He did not have a blade. He had never carried one in his life, had no need of one at a forge. What he had was the hammer, the same iron-headed, oak-handled hammer that had broken a man's collarbone in a stable yard 3 weeks before, and he swung it now with everything his body had left, not at Sharamph, never at Sharamph, but at the taut rope stretched from the gallows beam to the noose around her throat, and the rope, worn and hurried and hastily knotted, parted under the blow a bare instant before the trapdoor gave way beneath her feet. She fell not hanged but falling, the severed rope trailing loose from her neck, and Samuel dropped the hammer and caught her, both of them going down hard onto the gallows platform together, his arms locked around her, her face pressed into his shoulder, both of them shaking, both of them alive, while the whole square erupted into chaos around them, and the road wardens ran Garrick Thorne down before he made it 20 paces. "You absolute fool," Sharamph gasped against his shoulder, her voice raw from the rope's bite, her whole body trembling in a way he had never once seen from her, not even bleeding in a stable yard. "You could have missed. You could have." "I don't miss," Samuel said, though his hands were shaking so hard he could barely feel them, "not when it matters this much." She pulled back just far enough to look at him, and there were tears standing in her yellow eyes, the first he had ever seen there, and she laughed a broken, disbelieving, joyous sound, and kissed him right there on the gallows platform in front of the entire square, in front of Lord Rennick and Mistress Odell, and every soul who had thrown a stone or a rotten apple or an ugly word at her 3 weeks before, and none of them said a single thing to stop her, because there was nothing left to say. The letters told the rest of it plainly enough for even the most frightened heart in that square to understand. Garrick Thorne, questioned hard by the road wardens before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, confessed everything in exchange for a mercy he did not deserve and did not entirely receive. How Lord Vald had paid him to salt the treaty talks with distrust from the start, how the ambush in the stable yard had been his hired men, how the murdered grain merchant had been killed by Vald's own agent, and the knife planted for Thorne to find and twist into a noose around an innocent woman's neck. All to see the fragile peace collapse and the profitable chaos of border war return. Lord Aldous Rennick, white-faced with the horror of how close he had come to hanging an innocent woman on a traitor's word, tore the false evidence from the market table with his own hands and burned it in the square's central fire pit before the whole town, and then turned to Sharamph, still standing on the gallows platform with Samuel's arm around her and a rope burn livid at her throat, and did the only thing left that might begin to mend what fear and haste had nearly broken beyond repair. "Sharamph Bonecrusher," he said, his old voice carrying clear across the hushed square, "heir of the Bonecrusher clan, I owe you an apology this town does not deserve to have accepted, and I am asking for it anyway, because the alternative is losing a piece I believe in more than I have ever believed in anything in my long, tired life." Sharamph looked at him for a long moment, then at the crowd beyond him, the same crowd that had thrown stones and ugly words, now silent, ashamed, watching her with something that had shifted in the space of one terrible morning from fear into something closer to awe. "I came to this town," she said, loud enough for all of them to hear, her hand finding Samuel's and holding it without hesitation, without shame in front of every soul present, "because I believed peace was worth more than my pride and worth more than my fear, and I still believe that, even after a rope was put around my neck for a crime I did not commit. I do not forgive this town its stones. I forgive this town its fear, because fear, at least, I understand. What I ask in return is that you look at me now, standing here, and see a woman who was ready to die alone rather than let this peace fail, and understand that I did not have to be alone in it, in the end, because one man in this town looked past everything he was raised to fear and chose to stand beside me instead. If that is not proof enough that our two peoples can share more than a border and a bad history, I do not know what proof you are waiting for." The silence that followed was long, and then it broke, first in a low murmur and then in something closer to a rising cheer, ragged and uncertain at first, and then gathering conviction as it spread. Because a town that has nearly hanged an innocent woman is a town desperate for a way to feel like it has, in the end, done something right, and Lord Aldous Rennick gave it to them by stepping forward, unrolling the original treaty scroll retrieved, unsigned. from the jail where it had sat forgotten through 3 days of trial, and signing it there on the gallows platform itself, with the whole town watching, sealing peace between the Bonecrusher clan and the border towns in the very place. Lai had nearly bought a war instead. What happened between Samuel Graves and Sharamph Bonecrusher in the weeks that followed was not a quiet thing, and neither of them tried to make it one. She stayed. There was no question of her riding back to the mountains alone, not with a treaty to see properly settled and a bond to see properly built. And Lord Rennick, eager to smooth over what his town had nearly done, granted her guest right in the border district for as long as she cared to claim it, which turned out to be considerably longer than a season. She moved her few belongings into the small room above Samuel's forge, without either of them quite discussing when that had been decided, and the trade road folk who passed through the crossroads inn began to tell, over their ale, the story of the orc Heir and the smith who had cut her down from a noose with a hammer, until the story outgrew the truth in the comfortable way good stories do, though the heart of it never needed exaggerating at all. There came an evening, some 6 weeks after the trial, when Sharamph led Samuel out past the edge of the village to the low hill where the trade road curved north toward the mountain she had once called home alone. And there, beneath a sky gone violet with early stars, she took his hand and pressed it flat against her own chest, over the fast, steady beat of her heart, and told him what she had never told another living soul. "Among my people," she said, "when a warrior chooses another to stand beside for the whole of her life, and not merely for one fight, she marks them, and is marked in turn, so that anyone who looks may know. Here stands a bond that will not break for fear, or for distance, or for the ugly words of small men. I have never given this mark to anyone, Samuel Graves, because I never believed anyone was foolish enough, or brave enough, or simply enough, to want to stand beside me for the whole of it, rather than merely admire me from a safe distance the way men admire a storm they are glad is not aimed at them. I've been aimed at by that storm since the night you nearly took my head off in a stable yard mistaking me for a fourth attacker," Samuel said, and she laughed despite the solemn weight of the moment, low and warm, the laugh he had come to treasure above nearly every other sound in the world. "I'm not asking you to be less of a storm, Sharamph. I'm asking to keep standing in it. For good. However that's done, in your clan's way or mine, I don't much care which, so long as it's done and it's true." She drew a small blade, no longer than her palm, and with a steadiness that made Samuel's chest ache to watch, she drew it across her own forearm in a shallow line. And then, when he did not flinch or pull away, across his in turn and pressed the two wounds together, skin to skin, blood to blood, in the old way her father had once described to her as a girl, and she had never expected to use herself. "Now," she said, her voice rough with an emotion she made no effort to hide, "you are marked as mine, Samuel Graves, and I am marked as yours, and no clan council, no border lord, no lying reeve, no rope, will ever again find it easy to put a knife between us." "Good," Samuel said, and kissed the mark on her arm and then her mouth, and there, under the darkening sky at the edge of the road she had once ridden alone, he made her a promise with no ceremony but the truth of it. That he would stand beside her through every fight left to come, that her storms were his now to weather too, that he had spent 29 years overlooked and unremarkable, and would spend however many years were left to him being, instead, the one thing in this whole wide hard world that Sharamph Bonecrusher had chosen to keep. The treaty held. It held through a hard winter and a harder spring, through the inevitable grumbling of border folk slow to unlearn old fears and clan elders slower still to trust a peace bought partly on a human blacksmith's courage. But it held, because Sharamph Bonecrusher made certain of it with the same fierce, uncompromising will she brought to everything, and because Samuel Graves stood at her shoulder through council after council, forge fire after forge fire, never once flinching from the weight of being seen openly as the man an orc clan heir had chosen above all others. On the first true day of spring, The whole of the crossroads inn's yard was given over to a gathering the trade road had never seen before and would talk about for years after clan warriors from the Bonecrusher Mountains riding down in their war paint and beads to stand alongside border town merchants and drovers, and the very townsfolk who had once thrown stones. All of them come to witness the formal joining of the two people's fortunes. And at its heart, the joining of two people who had refused, against every fear and every lie thrown at them, to be anything less than exactly, unapologetically themselves. Lord Aldous Rennick stood on one side of the gathered crowd, the Bonecrusher clan's eldest surviving elder on the other, and between them stood Sharamph in her same worn travel leathers, cleaned and oiled for the occasion, and Samuel in his best shirt with the soot scrubbed as clean from his arms as 3 days of scrubbing could manage. And when the elder asked, in the old tongue, and then in careful common speech for the human half of the crowd, whether the clan Heir stood here of her own free will and choice, Sharamph Bonecrusher looked past the elder, past the crowd, past every soul who had ever doubted her, straight into the steady, soot-scarred, unremarkable, beloved face of the man beside her, and said the two words that closed the whole long, hard, beautiful shape of their story into something no rope or lie or border war would ever again be strong enough to break. I do. The cheer that went up from that yard, orc and human voices tangled together in a single sound for the first time in a generation, carried all the way down the trade road, past the inn where a spy had once tried to end everything before it began, past the gallows platform long since torn down and burned, past the smithy where a hammer still hung on its peg beside a fresh new set of tools waiting for 2 sets of hands to use them, and out toward the mountains where a clan that had once doubted a woman's right to lead alone now sent riders home to say that their heir had not merely survived being alone. She had chosen, at last, not to be. Samuel Graves, who had spent 29 quiet years overlooked at the edge of an ordinary life, took the hand of the fiercest, most beautiful, most fiercely loved woman on either side of the border, and did not let go of it again for the whole of that long, bright spring day, nor for any of the many good years that followed, in which the crossroads inn became known up and down the trade road not as the place where a traitor had nearly burned a fragile peace to ash, but as the place where an orc clan heir and a human blacksmith had stood together, in front of everyone, and proven that some bonds are forged the same way good steel is, under heat, under pressure, and never, ever alone.